They were once as common in the West as those big panoramic vistas that you see in the blockbuster cowboy movies. And the similarity is that this particular animal seems to take quite well to a variety of landscapes. Whether it is up high in a lush meadow in a boreal forest, or down in the open stretches of the Great Plains, the mule deer is one of our most adaptable wildlife species. The parched Southwest deserts suit him just fine. And he has always had a special affinity for the Colorado Plateau. But the impacts of early settlement and man's desire to tame the last frontier did not come without a price for this endearing species. Hall Sawyer is a research biologist and mule deer expert from Laramie, Wyoming.
By the turn of the century, that is 1900, mule deer became scarce because of unregulated hunting. But we saw mule deer populations recover in the 1920s and 30s as wildlife management and wildlife laws got some traction and were formed. And by the 1950s and 60s, we reached all-time level highs for mule deer.
Anyone who roamed the haunts of the mule deer in those good old days will never forget the sight of the big bucks and the big herds bounding around just about everywhere. But the abundance was taken for granted. As the West was gradually developed, the necessary safeguards to keep the herds flourishing were neglected.
Beginning in the 70s and throughout the 80s, Wyoming and the West in general saw long-term declines in mule deer populations. And that remained the case until, the early to mid-90s. And since the early to mid-90s, in Wyoming anyways, we've stabilized our deer populations.
In the first decade of this century, in states like Wyoming and Colorado, the mule deer is holding its own. In other parts of its historic range, the species is just hanging on.
And that's been due to a variety of factors, most important of which is habitat changes and habitat decline. It's been due to fire suppression, urbanization, human encroachment on habitats. Today, habitats are being fragmented and lost at an unprecedented rate. We're dealing with drought that affects the primary food sources for mule deer in a negative way.
And then mixing into the equation is disease. In particular, chronic wasting disease, or CWD, has crept into both the deer and elk herds in a number of western states. A relative of mad cow disease, the neurological disorder causes holes in the brains of its victims and is fatal.
We know that interactions with animals, animal to animal, can cause transmission. We also know that the environment can be a source of infectivity. And we know that even after animals die and their carcasses decompose, the ground around those carcasses can be a source of infection. There's some things that we still need to learn. Certainly, we don't know as much as we'd like to about the ecology of the disease, how long it persists in environments once it's been there, what kind of effects it has on deer and elk populations, and those are the subjects of some of our planned and ongoing research right now.
While the jury is still out on what impact CWD has on overall mule deer populations and other affected big game, there is one area where wildlife experts have rendered a universal verdict.
The critical thing is going to be winter habitat. They have to be able to move. They do it in established migration corridors. You cut one of those corridors, you degrade one of those winter ranges, and the impact is vastly disproportionate to the percentage of habitat disturbed, maybe of the total range of that population.
And along those same lines, you want to minimize the amount of human activity, human disturbance in these winter ranges so that those mule deer don't undergo any unnecessary energy expenditures. Every time those deer are spooked, or if they can't forage next to a road or forage where they want to, that's an increased cost in terms of energy expenditure, and we'd like to try to minimize that on our winter ranges.
Wildlife professionals in states like Colorado and Wyoming have gone to the air in efforts to learn more about the needs of mule deer. A net gun is used to temporarily disable the animals so they can be fitted with radio collars and then tracked throughout their range. Biologists learn vital information like seasonal distribution and migration patterns, mortality rates and fawn survival, so they can make calculated decisions on what is best for the species. While it can adapt well to a number of different habitat types, what the mule deer has trouble dealing with is an alteration of its food sources.
The things missing for vibrant mule deer populations these days are a good forb understory in the sort of stuff you're looking at behind me, and healthy shrubs which have good nutrient content, because in the wintertime what's sticking above the snow is what benefits the mule deer. And of course, if you don't have those forbs, then the deer don't get nutrition that they need during the summer, and they go into the winter in bad condition, and they usually come out of the winter in bad condition if their shrubs are in bad shape.
Some studies point to overgrazing by cattle in sensitive habitats and native plant communities as being a contributing factor. The extended drought in many areas of the West has only exacerbated the situation.
I think there could be an improvement or increased awareness of a larger conservation ethic. First would be is this key of habitat and to maintain healthy native shrub communities across the range of mule deer. The second step is to continue to identify and protect migration routes so that we can sustain these large migratory deer herds. And third would be to minimize the amount of development and human disturbances that are occurring on our winter and our transition ranges.
To meet the challenge, the Wyoming Game and Fish Department is one agency that has drafted a plan for the times.
The Wyoming Mule Deer Initiative is a management plan for mule deer throughout the states and focuses the need to do habitat management practices, improve habitat managements on a grand scale. It's our goal that our kids and our grandkids will have the opportunity to enjoy this spectacular species.
It is estimated that the mule deer has graced these grand landscapes for up to 12,500 years. It only makes good sense that we carry the torch for something so important to the integrity of the Western ecosystems.
They're just a special species. I think everybody grows up admiring deer in general, but when you consider how adaptive and beautiful mule deer are, they inspire something in a lot of people. You know, to me, they're just an icon of the West.